So now we are entering the third module, right? So in this third module, so it's built on the previous module, largely the third module. Just remind you what we learned in the third module. In the third module, we studied two models. One is income expenditure model. The other is aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. So these two models help us understand the fluctuation of our economy in the short run, right? But remember, at the beginning of the class, I mentioned there are two big topics in macroeconomics. One is long-run economic growth. The other is short-run economic fluctuation. So we have one chapter covers long-run economic growth. And then we also study what matters to long-run economic growth, right? So in order to achieve long-run economic growth, what do we need? We need technology growth. We need accumulation of physical capital and human capital. We also need the growth of labor force, right? So that's how we achieve long-run economic growth. Okay, and then in terms of short run, right? So first, so short run fluctuation usually is caused by a shock to the demand, right? So that's from the Keynesian view. Okay, and then so when there's a shock to our economy in the short run and particular demand, and then so we either in a recession or in the inflationary gap or like expansion, right? So without government intervention from AD and AS model, we knew so eventually the economy is going to adjust and so restore the economy back to the long run potential. So that's what happened. But we also learned, so even though so the economy has the ability to self-correct its mistake or to self-correct its wound, okay? But this process can be lengthy and it can be painful. So we are talking about 10% of people lost their job. We are talking about the standard of living can lose by 20% for a decade. Okay? So that's very substantial. Okay? And then from the analysis we have in the third module, and then we realize or we see the potential of government intervention to mitigate the economic fluctuation, right? And then so in this module, we are going to exclusively see how government can achieve that goal. But again, so we focus on short-run fluctuation, right? So in terms of long-run economic growth, the government also can play a major role, right? So for example, the government can encourage innovation. The government can encourage saving. The government can encourage labor supply, right? So all of those things are beneficial to our long-run economic growth, right? But nevertheless, here we are going to focus on short run. So here, when we say short run, usually is shorter than a few years, and most of the time just in a matter of few months, like inside 1 year. Okay, so that's what we are going to focus on. We start with fiscal policy, okay? And this is a roadmap of this chapter. Okay? So we are going to look at what is considered as fiscal policy, like a definition. And we relies on earlier model we studied. Okay, and we are going to quickly understand so why it is an important tool. I mean, it's fiscal policy. Why it can help us to manage economic fluctuation. Again, so this is in short run, right? Again, so I emphasize the fiscal policy has a powerful impact on long-run economic growth. So that we already covered, right? Right, and then, so we are going to differentiate fiscal policy by expansionary versus contractionary. And we are going to see under which circumstance, so the government should take expansionary, and under which circumstance the government should take contractionary. And also understand each type of fiscal policy, how they affect our economy, right? And after that, so we're going to look at multiplier. So this is not the first time we look at the multiplier. We have seen this many times, okay? So we are going to see there's a multiplier effect of the fiscal policy, right? And then next, so we are going to look at budget balance. Okay? This is followed by public debt, okay? And we also talk about implicit liability. right? But those are closely linked with each other, right? So there's a video, okay? So in class, so we won't have much time to watch. So I'll leave that for you. I encourage you to watch, but essentially this is the second part of the earlier video we watched, right? So essentially there are two gentlemen, Keynes versus Hoya. So these are two big giants in 20th century in terms of economic thoughts. So they have very different idea or have different understanding regarding to how the economy works, right? In the first half, so they are arguing with each other how economy works. And in the second half, in this one, they argue each other. So the role of the government, okay? Should we have a proactive fiscal policy or not? Right, so I encourage you to watch. Now, let's look at fiscal policy. And let me start with some basic facts. Okay? So here we look at 4 countries, United States, Japan, Canada, and France. And we look at their government spending, that's this light green one, and the government tax revenue, this dark green one, right? And so we can make a few statements from this diagram. First of all, you see across these 4 countries, okay, so the size of government is pretty large, right? So size of government, so you can measure by government spending. So to understand that, you say, so, okay, so each year, each dollar the society produces, okay, almost 40 cents at the end was spent by the government. And this number is much larger in France. Okay, more than 60% of the resource, and then went to the hand of the government. This is number 1, right? But certainly you may be wondering, so why we need such big government? Okay, so there are many reasons. In your principle of micro class, you may have heard a term called public goods, right? So example of public goods like clean water, right? Or think about a fireworks show. Okay, so this public goods is very different from private goods in the sense you use that, okay? You're very difficult to prevent somebody else to use that. So that's going to reduce the efficiency or reduce the incentive of the private party to provide these particular goods. So that's at the end, we rely on the government to provide. This is one reason. The other reason, the other things, so we need government action so that we can put things together. So for example, the social safety net, so which is essentially like a transfer from rich to poor, right? From healthy to unhealthy. Okay, so we need the government, right? And there are many other reasons why we need the government. Okay, so here I just give you 2 of them. So this is one, but certainly so we can have discussion. So what is the optimal size of government, right? But that just go beyond to our class. So this is a principle, just introduce you the basic concept and introduce you the basic questions and help you to pursue an upper level, right? The other things we notice is that for most of the country, most of the time, their spending exceeds their tax revenue. So by the way, the tax revenue you can consider is like income, right? Spending is their expenditure. For most of the country like here, and later, so we're going to look at United States throughout history, most of the time. So the government has larger expenditure than income. Okay? And then later you're going to see this called a deficit. Or in other words, there's a shortfall of income compared with your spending. Right? Okay, and then also later you're going to see, so this shortfall is going to accumulate and it's going to create long run problem. Right? Okay, so this is fiscal policy. This is a basic fact. Now, Here, just give you an idea. So how the government use the money, okay, where the money goes, right? So first, the government may provide transfer, okay? So the good example of transfer is during COVID-19 pandemic, the government provide a cash transfer to most American households, right? Like last year, so I believe most of us received a free check by the government, right? And again, so you're wondering why they need to do, why they want to do that. So that's the topic of this of this chapter. But for the moment, so they just give you a sense what is government transfer. Because when the government issue a check, so they are not expecting you to provide goods and service as a return. Now, the other important terms, social insurance program, right? Including Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So Social Security is a payment to elderly and sometimes to people who are disabled. Medicare largely covered healthcare for elderly and people who are disabled. And Medicaid, that's the healthcare for low income, okay? And particularly for women and for someone who with a young child, right? So you can see those are government programs to protect families against economic hardship. So this hardship coming from short of income, like Social Security or disability, and also include some health risk, right? So like healthcare. Okay? So this is the government. Now here we can look at the breakdown of the source of tax revenue in the United States, right? So the biggest one is personal income tax. So this is a tax we paid when we file our tax return every year, right? And then the next big single items is called social insurance tax. So if you ever receive a W-2, or if you ever pay attention to your W-2, I guess I would suggest you to pay attention to that. So in your W-2, so there are two items. Actually, so that was pre-withheld, and then you cannot claim tax return on those. This includes payroll tax and Medicare tax. Right? And usually this add up total of around 20%, right? And so what is the purpose of these two taxes? So the payroll tax largely used to support Social Security. So the idea is when I'm young, I have income, I pay this tax to support those old. When I old, I don't have income because I'm retired. And then so the government used the payroll tax collect from the future young to support me. Similarly, Medicare. When I'm young, okay, so I'm healthy, I pay Medicare tax to support those who are unlucky, get disabled, or those who are retired. And then so eventually, so when I become a retired person, or I got shock, sorry, I mean, the shock is like risk, health risk, right? Okay. And, or I got disabled, and then so the government is going to help me out. So that's a big item, right? And then so we have corporate profit tax. Okay, it's very small, and also that just draw a lot of attention. And in terms of how we reform the corporate tax. And then lastly, we have other tax. So this includes consumption tax, right? So if you buy stuff from Amazon or buy stuff in Target, right? Usually there's a tax, right? And usually, so there's certain stuff, the tax is higher. So for example, tobacco, right? Alcohol, so tax is higher, but it is considered as consumption tax. But then there are some items tax are lower. Think about essential food or beverage, right? Okay. And then so we have property tax. right? So maybe we have other tax, say for example, the inheritance tax, right? So if my parents passed away, so they left a legacy for me, and then so the government will tax away a fraction, right? So again, so you may want to think about, so why the government tax on those things? Okay, so let's leave that for upper level. And this just breaks down the government spending, how the government spend all those tax receipt, right? So the largest single item from here is very clear, right? Medicare and Medicaid. Right? Then the next one is national defense. Education. So this education includes K-12, public education, also includes higher ed. All right. All right. Oh yeah. So this Social Security. You see, so these two together is already 31%. Right. Now here, I want to draw your attention to these items. Interest payment. What is interest payment? So just to give you an idea to understand that. Okay, I guess most of us has a credit card, right? So credit card, if you ever pay your credit card late, I guess most of you have that experience. I have that experience as well. And usually they have interest charge. Okay, so why does interest charge? Essentially, so this interest on the debt you owe to credit card, right? Or other example, mortgage, right? So your parents have a mortgage or you have a mortgage, so they pay an interest payment every month. So because they borrow money from the bank, the same idea, government, so they need to borrow. And usually they borrow a large sum, right? But again, so we will discuss, so why they end up with the bigger debt, okay? So because this large amount of debt they have, so they need to pay up interest payment. And this is not trivial. This account 11% of their total spending, right? So we can do a quick calculation because earlier we talked about, so the total government spending is close to 40%. Among this 11% goes to interest payment, meaning 4% of our total GDP goes to interest payment every year. Right? So that's how you understand. And if you want to find out exact number, and then I'll give you an idea. So the total GDP is 20 trillion. And then so multiply by 4%, so that means every year. So the US government spent about 800 billion on the debt they borrowed. Okay, this is not a trivial amount. Right. So let's look at these quick questions. Government programs that are designed to protect individuals or families from economic hardship are described as social insurance. Thank you. Good. Now, we are ready to understand how the government fiscal policy can help the economy, particularly due to the short-run fluctuation. We started with this equation. We have seen this equation many times, right? Remember when we derive the income expenditure, when we derive this aggregate, demand aggregate supply, right? So we always start from this equation. And furthermore, so in the second module, we spent the entire chapter explain how we came up with precise measure. Very good. Okay. Now here, this is essentially, we look at the GDP through the lens of expenditure or through the lens of spending. or more importantly, through the lens of demand. Okay, and if there is a negative demand shock, okay, so you write down if there's negative demand shock, right, and usually we enter a recessionary gap. Without the intervention of the government, we knew so the economy can restore, right, largely through the adjustment in the labor market, right? Okay, but then now from this equation, we can see the government has the ability to mitigate this fluctuation. Why? It's because government can directly control G, and it can also indirectly affect C and I. Right? Let's go one by one. So G, basically the government says, okay, I'm going to carry out a spending program. Right? Like say for example, so back in 40s, so they decide to spend money to renovate highway system. Right? And in 2008, after the financial crisis, and then they decide send out money to do renewable energy, right? And then so in COVID-19, and then they start to send the money first to go to individuals, and then so maybe mainly money goes to business, right? So that's just G. And also they can indirectly affect C and I, but by the way, actually this C and I can already loosely talk about. So they through tax or transfer. Transfer, again, like last year. So pretty much all American family received a check from the government, right? Okay, so that will help. So that just indirectly affect the aggregate demand, right? But of course, so it can positively affect aggregate demand. It can also negatively affect aggregate demand, right? So, but certainly this is depending on the situation, right? But the main point from this slide is the government by directly control G and indirectly affect C and I, it can shift the aggregate demand curve, increase or decrease, okay? Now, we can summarize what is fiscal policy. So fiscal policy is the use of tax, government transfer, or government purchase of goods and service. So you can think about there are three tools. Let me write down tools. Okay, so there are three tools at the disposal for the government. So they can use each of them or maybe a combination of them to adjust the aggregate demand. Okay, and from here, so you can see, so this is largely coming from Keynesian, right? Because we focus on demand shock and we focus on the government's policy impact on demand. Okay, and in reality, usually due to their political view or due to their ideology, so they take different approach. Like Trump, he's a Republican, and usually so they like tax cut, right? Or like less regulation. On the other hand, President Biden, he's a Democrat, right? So Democratic Party, so they have a different view towards the government, towards the society, right? So they are going to take a different direction, right? Okay, so with those preparation, so we can look at the first characterization of fiscal policy or differentiation, right? So we are going to look at fiscal policy and categorize them as the expansionary versus contractionary. Okay, so what is expansionary and what is contractionary? So the easiest way to understand that is expansionary fiscal policy is like you're driving a car, okay? You are pressing the what's called, sorry, so which side is called? You're pressing the pedal, which pedal? Anyway, so you're trying to speed up your car, all right? So this is expansion of physical policy. Or you can think about, okay, so you are having a fireworks show, you're going to have more fuels or more fires. Right? On the contrary, so I'm going to come back to this. Okay, so first give you a big idea. On the contrary, the contraction of physical policy is something the government do trying to slow down the economy. Right? So it's like a car, you're trying to press the brakes to slow down. And then there are two questions. One, why they want to do that? And two, how they achieve that goal, right? So now just go one by one. Let's just back to the slides I just missed. First, expansion of fiscal policy. Okay. So they can achieve this goal. Basically, they just give the economy more momentum, run faster, right? So they can increase government purchase of goods and service, increase G. They reduce tax, okay? Or they increase government transfer, right? So I guess, so right now, so we have a perfect example, right? So the Biden administration, they have passed a bunch of laws or like acts, right? So essentially increase government spending and reduce tax for ordinary folks and then give transfers, right? So this is expansionary, right? And so actually, so from the previous slides, we can see this is going to both directly and indirectly affect aggregate demand, right? So now let's see so how that achieve that goal, and at the same time we will understand so why the government wants to take expansion of physical policy. So we are here. From previous chapter, we knew so usually this is after a negative demand shock, right? Okay, so and then we also knew without government intervention, so the economy eventually is going to like usually it happens from here, goes to here, and it goes to here, right? So I can just finish the picture. It's going to like this. Okay, I leave you to review. So why we move around? Let's go to 1 and 2 and 3. Right? So eventually, so there's a force that should push the aggregate supply to the right-hand side. I leave that for you to review. Okay. Now, we are going to look at what the government can do. What the government can do is, so they are going to try to push up this aggregate demand. But then, so how they can push up aggregate demand, that's exactly what we just saw in the previous slide, right? Expansionary physical policy. The other question is why they want to do that. So now it should be obvious, right? So we want our economy return to our potential. Okay, and then the only direction you can do is just push up. Because if you push down, so you are going to further away from your goal. Right? So from this graph, we understand a bunch of questions. Under which case, the government should use expansionary fiscal policy. And why expansionary fiscal policy can help. And how expansionary fiscal policy help to reach our policy goal. Right? So this is expansionary fiscal policy. So this is what happens. Right? Now, the other side of the story, we look at contractionary, right? So by the way, so expansion, contraction, the other way to think about it, if we have a balloon, expansion is it just blow in air. So the balloon is expanding. And the contraction is, so you're going to push the balloon and so just squeeze out some air. So it's the contraction. Right? So that's the other way we're thinking about. Okay. And how we can have contraction in physical policy. That's exactly opposite to what we just saw earlier, right? And then so you're going to have a reduction in G, increase in T, and a decrease in transfer. Oh, by the way, here I want to add a few words. increase in T. So tax usually reduce your incentive to work and your incentive to invest. To give you an idea, so if you work for 1 hour, you have $50. But the government says, okay, so I'm going to take away 50%. Okay, and then so your incentive to work is going to reduce, right? Because before I can happily take away $50. Now I have to hand out $25. What was the point for me to work hard, right? On the other hand, so if I invest like $1,000, I invest in stock market. But towards the end, so if I make 1,000 out of this 1,000, I have 2,000. The government says, okay, so I'm going to take away 500. So again, so you may not want to invest, right? Because someone is going to take away my hard-earned money. So that's why tax usually reduce incentive. And then you may be wondering, okay, why we need tax? The reason why we need a tax is we need the government, right? So I already give you the reason why we need government. So the government need to have some income so that they can support those government programs, right? And then some students may argue, okay, so why not we just print out the money? Isn't that the way government generates income? Yes, it is. Okay, so these are being widely used by most modern economy. But as you're going to see in the future chapter, so in printing money, and particularly printing more money, is equivalent to a tax. Okay, but this tax is more hidden. They're going to eat away your purchasing power. So that's equivalent to taxing you. Right? To summarize, we need tax to support the government, to provide something only a government can provide, but are good for our society. Okay. On the other hand, tax usually hurts our economy. And then, so the government is trying to strike a balance between the good and the evil of tax. All right. Okay, so this is contractionary fiscal policy. Right. Now we go to the other side of the story. Okay, so this again, so this is after a positive demand shock based on the discussion we have previous chapter, right? And again, so without government intervention, our economy has the ability to self-correct, to restore to its long-term potential, right? So this is what the economy can do. But again, so this adjustment process can be lengthy and it can be painful. But here, so usually depends coming from the high price. Okay? Now, what the government can do? So they can potentially push down. Again, so if they push up, so that's going to make the problem even worse, right? So you're going to see even higher inflation, even larger inflationary gap. All right. But then, so what the government can do so that it push down the aggregate demand. So that's exactly what we discussed in previous slides. Contraction or fiscal policy. Okay. And then similarly, so you can see these slides answer a couple of questions. When, why, and how. When we need a contraction fiscal policy. Why fiscal policy help and how it help, right? So that's the question we asked. Okay, very good. And you may be wondering, so did the government really ever take contraction fiscal policy before? The answer is yes. Okay, so we are going to show you the history later, right? But most of the time, so we have expansion in fiscal policy, but that's just in recession. And usually once the recession is done, and then they start to winding down or rewinding their expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, so that is equivalent to a contraction fiscal policy. Just think about, so they stop to offer tax reduction. They stop to send you a free check, right? So that's equivalent to a contraction rate. Now let's look at these practice questions. So I guess based on the discussion we have, and particularly if we view our work through the lens of Keynesian, okay, so that just means usually our recession is caused by negative demand shock. So that's what I mean, Keynesian view, right? And then, or our theory justify massive spending during deep recession. They just remind you the mistake President Hoover and his administration made. So instead of massive spending, so they were trying to balance the budget. Okay, and I'm going to show you the equation later, but essentially if you're trying to balance the budget, so what you need to do is you need to reduce G, you need to increase T. And then so from the discussion we have so far, this is very counterproductive, particularly during the recession. But that's exactly make the Great Depression so deep. But again, so as I explained earlier, so we really can't explain, we really can't blame their mistake, because at that point, no one really knew what's going on, right? It's only after the Great Depression, we start to develop this theory. All right. Okay. So there's another question. So this is not a multiple choice question. So this is a case by case discussion. All right. Suppose a country wishes to produce its potential output level. Okay, meaning so we want to go to YP. All right. Now holding everything else constant, identify which of the following policy initiatives might help it reach the goal, and how these policy initiatives would help. Start with A. The government initiated policy that encourage private spending. So certainly this is going to help, right? So this is considered as expansionary policy. And usually this work through reduced tax. Right, so this first one. B, the government increased the amount of money it borrows in loanable fund to increase level of government spending in the economy. So this question is a little bit tricky. So there are two parts. Part number one, the government borrows to increase government spending. So in that sense, it will help. But this comes with the cost. The cost is the government borrow from the loanable fund. Okay, and usually, so we have limited resource. So this loanable fund, just imagine the total saving we have in our economy, right? Or the total money we have in the financial system. If the government want to increase government spending by increase their borrowing, so usually that's going to have a negative impact on private investment. Because if you get them all, there are only $1 trillion. Okay, so the government wants to take away 500 billion. You only leave 500 billion to private market, private party to invest. So that just means, so you increase government spending by borrowing, so you could hurt private investment. And then the net impact, depending on which one is stronger. But also, as we are going to see later, it could be the case government spending can increase the total amount of money that is available in the loanable fund market. How that works, essentially, it could be the case, the government invests in some high-tech sector or invest in a sector that can potentially help our long-run economic growth. So essentially just make the economic pie larger. So then we have more savings. We have more money flow into financial market. Right? So in that sense, this is a tricky question. Now C, government increase tax. Certainly this is counterproductive, right? So this is going to have a contractionary impact. D, the government authorized new spending. So the certainty that will help, right? But you may want to combine with B, okay? To consider how the government is going to finance this spending, right? Nevertheless, all the answer or details are in these slides, okay? So I encourage you to read through and make sure you understand what we just discussed, okay? Now, so we have a basic sense, what is fiscal policy? How fiscal policy can help, right? So then, so in practice, okay, there are critics that argue against fiscal policy, in particular expansion of fiscal policy, right? So this includes the following. Number one, they were worried about the government spending could crowd out private spending. What this means? So this crowd out means, okay, so if I spend, and then that's just going to force you to spend less, or it's going to reduce your ability to spend. So this is what we mean crowd out. It's like in the height space. I joined the party, I'm going to squeeze you or push out somebody else. So this crowd out. Okay. The second, government borrowing crowd out private investment spending. So that just follow the discussion we just had in the discussion question. We have $1 trillion. The government joined the party, borrow 500 billion. And then the private party, the total amount they can borrow will reduce from 1 trillion to 500 billion. Now, so this is the critique, the second critique. Third critique, government budget deficit is going to reduce private spending. What they say is, okay, so if the government spend too much, more than they can earn, means from the tax they collect. So they have a deficit. And this deficit must finance by something, right? Because think about as an individual, we borrow from the bank, pay to finance a mortgage, or you use credit card to pay your phone, or pay your car, or pay your computer. So eventually you have to pay, right? So essentially you just borrow from the future self, right? And plus interest. And then, so this critic says, okay, so the government budget deficit is going to reduce individuals' future purchasing power. All right, so that's what it means. So these three critiques, they hold under certain circumstance. But we also find out the cases, they may not be true. Okay, now let's go one by one. Right, the first critique, government spending always crowd out private spending. Right, so use this background picture as an example to help you to understand. Right, so if we consider our economy as this jacuzzi, and if the seat, but usually seat is limited, right? Let's just say, for example, there are 7 seats, okay? And if we already have 7 guests inside, And then, so anyone wants to jump in, so that's going to crowd out, right? And also in economics, we call there zero-sum game. What is zero-sum? So usually zero-sum game means, so this is a game, at the end, okay? So one person win, must means other person lose. One person get $1, it must means there's other players lose $1. So this is zero sum. But in reality, so we are going to see lots of games that's not zero sum. Meaning, so there are games, so in which all the players can take away a prize, right? And there's in here, in this example, okay, so there are two ways to understand this is not a zero sum. Number one, so we have 7 seats. So instead of 7 guests, so we may only have 2 guests. And actually, this is probably just parallel to what happens during recession. Because during recession, usually the business is work under the capacity, right? So in the AD and AS curve, we are below our potential. So if we only have 2 seats, you have 1 guest join, it won't crowd out, and even better, actually is make the party more fun, right? So in that sense, this is not zero-sum game. This is number one. The other way to think about this is, so if you have a guest to join, like in this case, government spending, so you can potentially, you can make this jacuzzi bigger. Before you can only accommodate 7. Now this spending, government spending is going to elevate this jacuzzi. So you're able to accommodate 10 guests, right? So in that sense, it won't reduce the existing guest welfare. On the contrary, so we can increase the total welfare, right? But certainly depending on where we are, right? So like say, if we already full, okay, usually this happens in the inflationary gap, and then government spending doesn't help. But if we were in a recession, government spending help, right? So we need to be careful. So to decide or to tell where we are, so that we can say this claim is true or false. Okay, this is the first claim. Okay, now go to the second claim. Government borrow always crowd out private investment. The idea is, let's just formalize. You have $1 trillion. The government wants to borrow 500 billion. So then you're going to squeeze or just cut this off, right? You're going to reduce the private investment because you left fewer resources for private party to borrow, right? But then in reality is, this is similar to the previous discussion. So if the government, like in the examples given to you, spent 500 billion, this goes to a sector or goes to the aspect of our economy that can potentially increase our GDP, right? There are many ways they can do. So for example, infrastructure, right? So for example, renewable energy. So for example, R&D, right? So that can potentially increase our GDP. So, and then follow the early example that can potentially raise the available fund. It could be increased from 1 trillion to 2 trillion, right? So that's the story. But again, so this is not always true, but it is a possibility. As a matter of fact, 2020, the CARES Act, the government spent a lot, they borrowed. And then the interest rate was very low. Now, how we understand the connection? So interest rate reflects the cost of borrowing. All right. And then the cost of borrowing is going to affect by the supply. What's the supply? Essentially the saving or the money we have. So interest rate is low, meaning the cost of borrowing is low. Okay. So usually this just means there are lots of supply because everyone trying to sell their savings. Right. And then so I'm going to ask for a lower interest rate because I have so much money I want to lend out. Okay, I'm going to charge you a lower interest rate, so you're going to do business with me, right? So this is just an indicator. This government spending or government act, instead of crowd out private investment, it generates larger amount of loanable fund. Okay, so this just show off by lower interest rate. Now this is give you example. Okay. So now we go to the third claim. Okay, this third claim is a little bit subtle, right? So let me try to explain again because I gave you some idea before. So this is a government budget deficit, reduce private spending. Okay. So what is the idea? So we started with government has some deficit, but this deficit comes from where? Usually coming from lower tax, increased government spending, right? How we understand that? Because tax is the income of the government. Spending is the expenditure. The reason why you have a deficit is your income less than your spending. Okay, so this is where we start. Now, if we only look at the decreased tax, and you may think this is a good thing, like naively think, right? So if you reduce tax, so that just means the households has more disposable income today, right? Okay, but then Ricardo, by the way, so this is the same Ricardo we studied earlier, who invented the idea of comparative advantage. And he said, wait a second. So you reduce tax today, fine. Okay, so the household is going to enjoy a benefit or blessing for now. But now you need to think about, okay, so the government is running a deficit, like think about individuals. So you borrow money from the credit card, but eventually you have to pay. But how you can pay? For the individual must come from your future income. For the government must come from their future income. But what is the source of the future income for the government? Must come from future tax. That just means, so yes, you're going to reduce my tax today, but in future, you will raise my tax, right? And so, because eventually, just think about, okay, so in your credit card, right? So you borrow $100, and in future, you must pay more than 100 because the interest, right? And then, so if you look at the big picture, okay? So the credit card company is not giving you free lunch. And then the same here. So the government is not going to give you free lunch. They reduce the tax today, so they are going to increase your tax more substantial. So just cancel this each other, right? So that's recording equivalent. And then they say, okay, so as a matter of fact, the deficit finance tax cut won't increase private spending. On the contrary, so the households, instead, they may reduce their private spending. Why? They need to save money for future tax rates. So that is David Ricardo's idea. Now, what are the problems in this idea? So there are at least two flaws. I wouldn't say flaw, probably like two strong words. Okay, so there are two exceptions. Number one, do you really think everyone can do this sophisticated calculation? You are college students. Now, so you are above average. I bet most of you never heard this idea before, right? So that just means, okay, so in reality, a big chunk of population did not realize there's a link between today's tax and the future tax, right? So this is number one. Or in other words, meaning, so not every individual are sophisticated as Ricardo. Okay, so they won't see that tax rights coming. So they may happily increase their spending today. Okay, as a matter of fact, so the 2020, the CARES Act sent us a check. Okay, and so actually, so most of the households increase the spending. But certainly there are other reasons. That is one small example, show you these recording equipments may not hold. This is one exception. The other exception. Okay. So yes, the deficit reduce tax and needs tax increase in the future. But what about, just what about? Actually, this is happening now. The government hold on this tax increase until very, very far future. And you may wonder how they can do that. So the way they do, the trick is, so the government is going to borrow in super long term. Like say, a mortgage, usually we have 30 years mortgage, right? Not just imagine we have 100 years of mortgage, or you have a debt you need to pay off in 100 years. What does that literally means to us? Isn't that the free borrowing? Because we know 100 years from now, we all gone, right? So let's just leave aside the discussion and say, for example, like inheritance. Let's say, again, our children doesn't responsible to our debt, right? But then, so in this discussion, okay, the government can borrow in super long term, meaning so the deficit or the tax rates won't come before the debt is due, but the debt is going to due in 100 years. So that means they won't raise the tax over the current generation. And that means the current generation, they will benefit this tax cut, and it's real. If it is real, and then the households is going to happily increase their spending instead of reduce their spending. All right. So you see, so there are two exceptions. It's going to reduce the theoretical power of recording equivalence. But this doesn't say it's okay, recording equivalence is nonsense. Okay, we still need to be careful. So the recording equivalence has a great point, right? So nothing comes at free. Okay, this is also true for government, right? Okay, so let's just stop here for this section, and we continue in the following one, right?